There is an age-old saying in war: boys study tactics, men study logistics. Greetings, loyal members, and welcome to this Dominion War special episode on logistics. Today we're going to be looking at the logistics during the Dominion War, what the different sides employed, what the difference between offensive and defensive logistics are, and ultimately how the infrastructure of the 24th century ultimately dictated the shape of the war. So, without any further ado, let's get right into it, and I'll start by introducing my special guest, Perun. G'day mates, this is Perun here, and we're going to put a few shrimpies on the barbie, and we're going to crack open a few tinnies, but first we're going to sit down, really get down into the nuts and bolts of logistics in the 24th century. So, in a world of industrial replicators, it's very easy to build massive armadas. However, without the proper infrastructure, good luck using them anywhere. Okay, I can't keep up that voice. Perun, if you are watching, miraculously, I would be very interested to know your thoughts, but in any case, the point still stands. In the 24th century, industrial replicators exist, and this rather expedites starship construction. So the limiting factor now is not necessarily how many starships you can build, or even how quickly you can build them. Instead, it's really a case of the wider infrastructure that exists to support these ships. There's ultimately three things that ships need: fuel, people, and parts. Now, we can even break down fuel into a subcategory. If you look at most conventional ships, they rely on three main elements to operate, those being dilithium crystals. By the 24th century, you're actively regenerating your crystals. Your crystal supply is going to last a lot longer, so that's going to be a low-frequency resupply issue. You're not going to need to take on dilithium crystals on the regular. Next, of course, is deuterium. Deuterium, that's pretty easy. You've got the Bazard ram scoop, and you can just go around and hoover up deuterium. There's a little caveat to that when it comes to wartime conditions. We'll get to it. And then thirdly, of course, there is antimatter. Now, while you can, using your fusion engines, turn deuterium particles into antimatter particles, you are ultimately then going to eat into your deuterium supply, since 2 deuterium are used to create 1 antimatter particle. And so generally it's just easier to just top up on antimatter rather than having to spend a lot of time going around and hoovering up more deuterium, which, while abundant, there's only so much in the universe. And particularly in different areas of space, if there's lots of starships moving through, it's going to be even more finite. So the other thing to talk about with regards to the infrastructure of the 24th century is that in the 24th century, civilian interstellar travel is far, far more commonplace. And this means that almost every significantly inhabited planet has stocks of deuterium and antimatter and dilithium crystals to enable the smooth movement of civilian vessels between worlds. This is ultimately what creates the prosperous 24th century, and it is also what will dictate the shape of the war. Ultimately, logistics is about getting necessary supplies to your starships in an efficient, organized manner. Now, in peacetime, this is generally accomplished in what we would call a hub and spoke system. This is relatively efficient, particularly if you have a very large amount of territory. So the best examples of a hub and spoke system would be the Federation or the Dominion. These are two nations which are very large. They've got a lot of territory to cover. And so essentially what a hub and spoke system is, a hub and spoke system is basically comprised of the various planetary capitals, and in and around it there's effectively a radius of supply bases. So the various planetary capitals, if we look at the Federation, we have all sorts of places like Gaza Prime, Tela Prime, Andoria, going all the way down to like Benzar. These are natural logistics centers because they are planetary capitals. They already have an awful lot of infrastructure built up around them. And so basically starships will just move between these different hub and spoke systems and pick up supplies where necessary. And of course, as well as that, you can also, for ships that are further out, potentially out exploring in deep space, you can send out purpose-built tankers to resupply these vessels. However, in wartime, this is all quite different. You see, in wartime, number one, you have a lot of ships concentrated in one place. And this means that there is a far greater strain on the local infrastructure. It's alright to supply starships that are sort of dispersed, diffused across your entire span of space. It's another thing to do it when thousands of starships are all lumped up in one direction because they're fighting a massive war. This means that, of course, inevitably, while local infrastructure can accommodate some resupply concerns, ultimately it's not going to be enough to supply an entire fleet, when we're talking about hundreds of starships operating out of just one star system, especially if you want to maintain the civilian infrastructure there as well. That's another thing to bear in mind. You've got to not infringe upon the civilian infrastructure, or infringe upon it as minimally as possible, because of course if civilian infrastructure stops, commerce stops, and then suddenly your entire economy grinds to a halt. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that you're seeing a more rapid expenditure of resources. During wartime, ships may not be able to comfortably cruise around the place. They may be called on to move much, much, much faster, which of course means that they're going to expend much more fuel. Not to mention that then you've got increased demand from more unpredictable circumstances like losses and battle damage. And this is another thing you've got to bear in mind when deploying ships, which is that, of course, you've only got so much fuel and you've got X number of starships. And also, you do not want to be losing large amounts of fuel if you lose those starships. So this also then puts an inherent limitation on the movement of starships, which is that they're only going to be given enough fuel to go as far as they need, because any more is just wasteful, because if that starship goes down, that supply of fuel also goes, and that can make the difference from the entire fleet being able to move to a quarter of the fleet being able to move, and then when that quarter gets to battle, the amount of fuel they have doesn't compensate for the fact that they're outnumbered 4-1. So with that in mind, I'll also talk about repair and maintenance of starships, again probably in a separate video. What this does demonstrate is that ultimately in wartime, tankers become all the more vital, because you're not just going to be relying on the stockpiles in the system that you're currently occupying, but you're also going to be needing the stockpiles from other nearby systems. And the other thing to bear in mind, of course, during wartime is that you see broken supply chains, because your territory gets invaded and the normal lines of communication are interrupted by virtue of the fact that there are two massive fleets squaring off with each other, and it's very difficult to run trade through. Now, when it comes to operating offensively, of course, the hub and spoke system is not really very effective, because when you're operating in an expeditionary or offensive capacity, you're not necessarily going to be very close to your main centers of logistics, and of course, you're actually going to be in hostile territory. And while you can try and set up supply bases, ultimately it's not going to be configured for you, and so therefore you're going to need a different form of logistics from a hub and spoke. And so this is where a trunk and branch system can be employed. The essential principles of a trunk and branch system is to centralize resources, transit resources, disperse them, and then distribute them. Now, all of these have various issues around them. So in terms of centralization, that relies on good communication between the fleets on the front line and the logistics centers, generally the planetary capitals, in order to make sure that the right resources are being provided. And of course, this takes time. Transit has a couple of other questions attached to it, the first of which is security versus frequency. This is a bit of a trade-off question. So the key thing in logistics is not necessarily quantity so much as it is frequency. So instead of sending one big ship with lots and lots of supplies, you can send lots of little ships carrying small amounts of supplies, but they will arrive more frequently, and you can maintain a chain going, the whole idea of a supply chain. And this provides you with a more consistent flow of resources, as compared to having let's say, one massive cargo ship, which of course is a massive target, equally, one massive cargo ship is an awful lot easier to protect in terms of security. And of course, having lots of smaller ships, which while they would give you a more consistent run of supplies, they are ultimately an easier target because it's hard to protect ships that are dispersed. And so generally some form of convoying will take place. But of course this results in greater lag time between resupply requests being submitted from the front lines, those resources being assembled and pooled, and ships being prepped, and then of course they all have to converge and get ready, and then they can move, resulting in a greater lag time. So it can bottleneck. However, there is a benefit to this, and this is that once you've got these lines of transit in place, it is very easy to extend them. So imagine it almost like a spring. It can compress and expand very easily, which makes it very good for attacking or indeed counter-attacking an enemy force. It provides you with a lot more security, which is of course extremely important if you are driving into hostile territory. And then the next step before actual distribution of resources is the potential dispersion of them. So this becomes a question of, do you have one big supply base near the front lines? That's a pretty big target, easy to take out. Equally, you could disperse resources into multiple supply bases. Potentially each fleet gets its own realigned supply base. However, of course, this then means that there's less overall, and then you run into a question of, well then, who gets what? So do you ultimately go for one large supply base or multiple smaller ones? Again, centralization of course offers greater security, but it also creates a greater target. And then equally, the other half of it is that it's potentially less responsive to each individual unit. Each individual unit may well be happier taking care of its own supplies rather than relying on their higher command to properly allocate supplies. When this tree system or trunk and branch system was implemented in 2374, it facilitated the rapid counterattack and effectively operated in 3 trees, upper, middle and lower. The Dominion were operating on a similar system. That was actually largely at the behest of the Cardassians, because the Dominion believed that they could simply forage their way forward, and the Cardassians realised that that was not going to work. And this is a key discrepancy that will come up later, which is that the Dominion don't really understand offensive wartime logistics. However, there are ultimately issues with this kind of trunk and branch system, and that is that it can be easily outflanked and outmaneuvered. It takes time to set up these trunks and branches. If you then outmaneuver an enemy, it takes time to create a new supply chain to support a new front line. And so that is where the hub and spoke system is generally employed on a more defensive basis. Because ultimately, when you are on the defensive, the war does not move to your tune, and so you can't know where the enemy is going to go next, and therefore where you're going to be called to fight them, and whether or not your logistics are going to be able to support that, as opposed to on the attack where you are ultimately controlling the pace of engagement. You are in control of the situation, and you will be able to know ahead of time where you will be fighting and where you will need those supplies. So really, the devil of it is making the transition between defensive and an offensive logistics systems. And arguably, a key component of this is the employment of armed auxiliaries. So these are of course different to merchant ships. Merchant ships, ultimately, when it comes down to it, they can say no. They can say, this is too dangerous, I don't want to risk my ship, and you don't really have any power to compel them. Now, of course, if you're a Cardassian, that's maybe a little bit different, but certainly in the Federation, no, and the best thing you could possibly do is requisition their vessels, but then, of course, you need a crew to crew the ship, and that's actually pretty difficult to come by when, of course, one of the other logistical concerns in the Dominion War is personnel. So, auxiliary ships are much better because they are able to resupplying fleets engaged in a hot zone where potentially the front lines are a little bit ambiguous. Now, of course, they all vary in how well armed they are, and it once again does come down to a bit of a risk-reward balance. The greater risk, i.e. the more cargo you carry, of course, the more reward logistically, but equally there's then the greater risk of attack, whereas if you heavily arm your auxiliary ship, it then means that it's capable of carrying far less in the way of supplies, so the reward is less. In terms of different kinds of auxiliary or cargo ships, this is basically any kind of cargo or transport or logistics or support vessel that is under the direct command of the fleets concerned. We have numerous examples. We have, of course, the Grommel or Klingon type transport. They are the same ship, manufactured probably by the same corporation. The Klingon one is a lot bigger than the Cardassian one, but they are effectively the same ships. Neither of them are particularly well armed. The Cardassians have a slew of different support vessels, some older than others, but you have big ships like the Telenor, smaller ships like the Miral. If in the Federation, we have, of course, the Olympic class, the Sydney class, that's generally used as a personnel carrier. There's the Elkins type, which is essentially a fuel carrier, an armed fuel carrier, and the Dominion do actually have their own supply ships in the form of Karama transports. Now, it's worth pointing out that, of course, these are cargo ships. These are merchants from the Gamma Quadrant that were brought over to the Alpha Quadrant under contract. But what this does mean is that they are not necessarily as well armed as some of these other auxiliaries, which aren't necessarily super well armed. Probably the best armed out of all of them is probably the Elkins. All of these are capable of somewhat defending themselves, and critically, they have trained crews who are trained to resupply their fleets in a hot zone. What this ultimately reveals is that the Dominion is very, very used to the hub and spoke system because they're used to patrolling vast swathes of territory and just dropping off supplies at various supply bases, bearing in mind, of course, Jem'hadar attack ships are not particularly long-range vessels, meaning that they don't need to invest the same level of supply and support vessels. Now let's also talk about some of the dynamic issues that you will face in the logistics situation of the Dominion War. As I said previously, it's not just about moving supplies, it's about moving people, replacement parts, entire fleets. More than once in the Dominion War, you're going to see entire fleets or multiple fleets move from one front to another in a single sweeping maneuver. And of course, that places an even greater strain on logistics, because if you're, say, fighting on a offensive footing, then what that ultimately means is that you've got to actually lay supplies out ahead of time before you can make that movement. So unlike in the trunk and branch system, which just needs effectively feeding, moving a fleet into an AO requires preparation, and so does moving a fleet between AOs. So it's not just about supplying fleets as they move between combat zones and different logistical sectors, because logistics is split up into, as I said, effectively 3 distinct trees, so to speak. But it then also becomes an issue of moving ships up to the front line, because remember, all supplies are going that way. And this means that they are effectively moving away. Say we've got a Klingon fleet moving all the way from the Klingon Empire to the front lines, which are on the far side of the Federation. You've got to have a means of supporting that movement when, of course, all supplies are being dragged off in one direction, effectively moving away from that fleet. Because otherwise there's going to be a little bit of what we would call logistical vampirism. Politically, it's not going to be very good if, for example, you have a load of Klingons show up who say, "We're here to help," and they steal all of your planetary fuel stockpiles and leave you completely dry and unable to maintain civilian commerce. In logistics, the enemy is not your only threat. Vampirism is a very real threat which will ultimately long-term kill morale and your war economy. So you need to ensure proper provisioning of fleets prior to their movement. Now, of course, there's a balance here because you need to properly provision a fleet's movement, but you also want to move these fleets pretty promptly. So there is a balance between getting everything laid out in time and also making sure that the fleet moves and gets into position before the enemy just overruns everything. So that's another thing to bear in mind. What this ultimately relies on is a smooth relationship between the civilian and military sectors. And the end result of this is, of course, that the civilian sector and civilian infrastructure is dragged into the war. So, for example, let's say you are a freighter captain and you have been contracted to drop some supplies off at a certain planet, which just so happens to be in the path of an advancing enemy fleet. But those supplies will be left there so that when the counter-attacking fleet arrives, they will have a full set of supplies. But of course now you've become a target. You've become part of the military infrastructure. Now you're not a Starfleet vessel. You're not a military vessel at all. But you are now a target because you are partaking in hostilities by ensuring the supply and support of fighters. Inevitably, this has consequences for you and for wider civilian infrastructure, which now also has military applications and so becomes a military target. So, just to wrap up, wartime logistics is ultimately about more than just setting up a system and feeding it. It's also about resolving dynamic and unforeseeable issues in a quick and efficient manner so as to facilitate the proper movement and support of fleets engaged in dynamic fighting. As much as logisticians want, wars seldom go exactly to plan, and so it's up to them to adapt and revise things quickly and efficiently. The best way to do this is in ultimately ensuring the smooth cooperation between the civilian and military sectors. Ultimately, there's a hell of a lot more civilian merchant ships and cargo ships than there are cargo ships under direct military control. And so ultimately you are going to be reliant on that civilian infrastructure and that civilian shipping sector in order to support your ultimate goal, which is to fight a total war. And of course, fighting total war has dangerous consequences. And logistics does not care if you wear a uniform or not. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And yes, Perun, if you see this, I'd welcome your input. Maybe those of you who know him potentially can send this to him for evaluation. I'd be very interested to hear it. So thank you all for watching. See you all next time.